I'm great. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this discussion.
I'm really, really happy that we've managed to find a time, because it's taken us a while to find a time. But also just really interested to hear more about you and how this book manifested, and the journey really of you first. So would you like to, well, welcome to the Women Ed Book Club, first of all. It's a privilege to have you. Could you
Thank
share a
you.
bit about yourself, please?
Of course. So nowadays, I suppose I describe myself as an education consultant and an author. I started life as a secondary school humanities teacher. History was my specialist subject, and I had a career in the classroom, and then in middle leadership and senior leadership in schools, predominantly in North, East, and Central London. Always working in underserved communities, very diverse communities. And I became a head teacher and was a head teacher for 16 years of three very different schools: an 11 to 18 mixed school, then an 11 to 16 girls school in Walthamstow. And then I had a wonderful opportunity in 2011 to set up a brand new school in Ilford, East London, which initially was going to be a year 7 to year 13 school, a secondary school. But within a year of being open, we had the opportunity to extend it to become an all-through school. So I ended up being ahead of a 3 form entry primary and a 6 form entry secondary, and growing them with the first reception cohort going through the primary and the first year 7 cohort going through the secondary. And then in 2018, obviously just before the pandemic, and I promise with no premonition of the pandemic around the corner, I decided that after 16 years of headship and leadership within schools, I needed to do something a little bit different. And I talked a lot to my staff and my students about pushing themselves out of their comfort zones and, being brave in their leadership. And I was doing quite a lot of work then for London Leadership Strategy, which was a wonderful organisation getting school leaders connected in London. And I ran a number of projects, programs for London Leadership Strategy, which had got me into school improvement work. And I was really enjoying working with heads of diverse schools, primary, secondary, special schools across London. And I realised that that was where my sort of passions were really focused. And so I went to be Director of Education Services at a large school improvement organisation, then called Hearts for Learning, now called HFL Education, which is based in Hertfordshire, but works not just with the sort of 550 odd schools in Hertfordshire, but with schools and settings all around, that region in London, in the home counties, and further afield as well. And for 6 years, I led the team of consultants and advisors working in right through from early years and PVI settings through to secondary, about 80 to 100 consultants and advisors. And then I had my most recent career change, which was just over a year ago. I'd started doing a lot of writing, and I had really got the writing bug, and I wanted to give myself more time to research and write. And I was also getting a lot of invitations to give talks and run workshops and do training beyond what I really had capacity to do in my day job. So I got to the stage where I decided that I was going to sort of work out a hybrid role. So I now work 2 days a week, or the equivalent of 2 days a week, for HFL Education. I've relinquished the sort of team leadership role, which is interesting after many years of sort of being in charge of teams. And I'm now part of the team that I used to lead. So I'm now what's called the lead advisor for underserved learners.
Right.
So I do a lot of work around closing attainment gaps for disadvantaged groups, working on eliminating economic exclusion and supporting schools and settings to really look at the true cost of the school day and what they can do to eliminate economic exclusion. For the last 3 or 4 years, I've done a lot of work around race equity and working with school leaders to affect race equity in their schools and settings as well. So that's a wonderful job to do within Hertfordshire and beyond, but it gives me the time and space to carry on with writing. I've just brought out another book this year, which is my 4th book, and also to accept invitations to do school improvement work and coaching and consultancy in a far more sort of national context.
Amazing. Wow, everything you said is so inspiring. But what was really interesting is the fact that your lens almost deepened in certain areas as well. So the fact that, you're looking at race equity and underserved, and how that there's an intersectional lens there as well. So it must be very finite in terms of the work that you're doing with certain communities and groups as well, because it seems like it's a very granular level that you're actually working at, even though it's quite macro.
Yeah, it is that a really interesting mixture.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll go to deliver a talk to a group of head teachers, and it's a sort of one-off event or occasion. But very often now I'm working with a trust in quite a sustained and ongoing and deep way.
Mm.
And perhaps, working with 7 schools in one trust over the course of a year to really affect raising aspirations and ensuring a culture of high performance for all learners. Or I'll do a talk which then leads to a school or setting saying, can you do something far more sort of deep and sustained with us? And yeah, I really enjoy the fact that I can build and sustain relationships over time and hopefully see some impact of the work that I'm doing with cohorts, in a longitudinal way.
Yeah, but it sounds amazing. Now, the fact that you have got time to write, your fourth book, we're talking about I want to say that it's your third book that we're talking about, isn't it?
The second one, actually.
Oh, right,
Yeah,
antique, right,
my
abstract.
first solo one.
Oh, wow, okay. So you've got it with you as well, which is amazing.
I have. Here it
So
is.
obstetrics for schools, and
I know.
I
Really
think.
strange title, right?
Well, yeah, it is, and yeah, it is. But I think what I love about your cover is how intersectional it is in terms of like there are so many lenses that you can look through in terms of that image on the book. So I can see why you've ended up writing that book based on your career. But what was the journey to get to this book?
Yeah. So it is a strange title, and I'll say a little bit about the analogy that runs through the book and why I chose to call it that. But it's really a book about how we create high performance cultures and schools within which all children can succeed, where there's a belief, an unswerving belief in the potential of all learners, and an ethos and a culture that's generated involving everybody within that organisation to maximise the chances of children passing through that school successfully and coming out the other end as educational successes. And it came out of just a conviction and a belief that I've had for years now, from the schools and the settings I've worked in, and the brilliant, inspiring leaders I've worked with, and the places that I've had the privilege of going to see brilliant work happening, that actually we can, crack the achievement gap. And that I've seen now through my work in London with London Leadership Strategy and my work in Hertfordshire with some inspiring schools and settings, that it's absolutely possible to eliminate a disadvantage gap and to have a culture in a school where all children are supported with the bespoke sort of support that they need to really thrive. When I went to Walthamstow School for Girls, which was my second headship, it was a really strong, high performing school. But I can remember when I went for my interview saying, I don't think you have to be sick to get better. And even though this school is a really strong school and it's getting some fantastic results, I think there's potential for the girls in this school to be thriving even more and to be achieving even more impressive outcomes. And that's what, in 7 years working there with a brilliant staff and community, we set ourselves the target to do. When I had the opportunity to open a brand new school, obviously it's exciting, but it's also daunting because you start with a completely blank slate and you have to decide, what's the vision of this school going to be? What are we aiming to achieve? What will success look like? What sort of targets are we setting ourselves? And I had an amazing chair of governors who was an American who'd had a very different sort of education to the one I'd had, and encouraged me to think really differently and to think really ambitiously about what it was possible to dare to dream to achieve, with children in that community. And we said, we're talking about GLD outcomes or Key Stage 2 SATS outcomes or GCSE or A-level outcomes. Why would we want to set ourselves aspirations or targets that were anything less than almost sort of 100%? Because with the very, very few exceptions of children who come into mainstream schools with really profound special educational needs, we really ought to be able to aspire for every child to pass out of school as a success. So that's really where the name came from, because I was looking at the world of obstetrics in medicine, safely delivering children through childbirth and through sort of infancy. And I started to get really fascinated by how the world of obstetrics had changed in the last sort of 150, 200 years. So I came across this amazing statistic that in um, born globally around the world didn't survive until their second birthday. No, sorry, only 43% did survive. So, effectively, you had a 1 in 2 chance of lasting until your second birthday if you were born in the year 1800. And that had radically reduced by 1950, 150 years later. The infant mortality rate around the world was just 23%. So it had effectively halved. And then by 2015, just before the pandemic, the global infant mortality rate, children who didn't last until their second birthday, had gone right down to 4.5%. And in the UK, it's less than 1%, it's about 0.4%. So we still, tragically have exceptions. And the difficulty with this analogy is, there are always heartbreaking stories that are the exception. And we know, ironically, since I've written this book in 2021, that actually our maternity care and some of our obstetrics records in the UK have dipped a little bit and got slightly worse. But still, despite that, notwithstanding that, overall, the world of obstetrics has changed astronomically, in the last 150 years. And we would not now, as a society, accept an infant mortality rate, of significantly more than what we have currently, and quite rightly. And yet in the world of education, we sort of do accept a really significant fatality rate, if you want to think about the educational equivalent. So we know that every year about a third of children age 11 fail to reach expected levels in terms of reading, writing, numeracy, maths. And the same at GCSE, about a third of children fail to get a grade 4 in English and maths, and therefore, they're not reaching the stage of educational standards that we would expect in order to thrive and access the next stage of their educational journey. And when we look at our economically disadvantaged children eligible for pupil premium, suddenly that looks more like 50%. Which is dangerously near where obstetrics was back in 1800.
Yeah.
But we don't see a national outcry about that. When the exam results or the SAT results come out in the summer, we don't see the papers saying this is an absolute scandal, how can this be happening? We've almost sort of accepted and, dare I say, expected now a sort of baked in fatality rate that's really sizable. And yet we know there are exceptions to that. We know that there are schools up and down the country where there aren't gaps, where all children are, achieving really well. And I was just fascinated to research what it is that schools that are achieving, really great outcomes for virtually every learner are doing. And that's what this book is about. It's sort of analysing what the conditions are for success for all, and what we can learn from those sort of shining examples that give us sort of hope and belief and optimism that it's possible for virtually every learner to be safely delivered through the education system.
I think that's such a powerful analogy that you've used in terms like that word fatality though. It's because whenever I've thought about education, it's about a child's life chance. And if you align that to that very strong word fatality, it just makes it even more real, really. Now, in terms of like, there's lots of takeaways that I've taken from what you've said about this book already, but I could see this being used in terms of initial teacher training, in terms of like that cultural awareness of what we're doing, in terms of social justice. I think there's definitely scope in terms of like CPD and developing cultural and, what do you want your culture to be in your school? So there's lots of leadership potential as well. What would you say is like the two, 3 key takeaways that you would want anyone reading this book in education to have? Because there's lots to take away, but I think, and I'm coming from a safeguarding lens as well. So with safeguarding, it's regardless of rank or position, we are all equal when it comes to safeguarding. And I think a book like this, it's the same sort of feeling that, this life chance that you have in front of you, it's all of our responsibility to help and do something with. So what would your key takeaways be for this book for, those that are working in education, whether they're site, whether they're wherever they are?
Yeah, I think you put your finger on such an important point. And when you look at research studies, time after time, they say that, none of this is easy. That there are obvious reasons why, the explanations for why we see children not reaching the levels that we would want for all of our children in our care. And it doesn't mean that, we're not committed or there's, poor teaching going on. Absolutely not. We know what a difficult environment it is to be working in education at the moment, and the funding challenges and the recruitment and retention challenges and the lack of, the level of external agency support that we would want for some of our most underserved children. So, the environment is tough. So this is not easy to do, but it is possible, it is achievable. And it's so much more achievable if you get the buy-in and the belief from everybody. Everybody in the picture has a part to play in this. So if you're a classroom teacher, there's a section in the book, chapter in the book, that's about what really effective teaching and learning looks like for a high performance culture. If you're a member of operational staff, you'd probably want to dip into the bits that are about forming really strong relationships with children and families and how that's everybody's role. If you're a leader, the section around, the important things that leaders do to create that culture will really speak to you. There's a section around the importance of transitions and how smooth transitions are particularly impactful for underserved learners and vulnerable learners who've had, disruption in their previous education or have particular sort of barriers or challenges. So if you're working in that sort of area of pastoral support for transition, that would be for you. There's a section around effective CPD and line management, which really talks to anybody who leads a team or has somebody that, reports into them. There's a section around eliminating economic exclusion, a section around building cultural capital. But yes, I really think that the way I wrote the book was very much to speak to different people in terms of, what's most relevant and pertinent to them in their role. And I've written it a little bit like a handbook. So there are lots of little activities, reflection points, questions, checklists, tasks to do, provocations. So it's regularly, the text is sort of broken up, and there are practical activities that you could lift and use in a middle leader discussion or could inform a staff training. There are quotations, hopefully inspiring quotations that I've got from here, there and everywhere at the beginning of each chapter that you could use within lessons or within assemblies. So hopefully it's the sort of book that you can just pick up for some ideas if you're looking at a particular sort of part of your role. Read a bit, think about it, perhaps, as you crash out at night and, go to sleep. It's not you need to begin on page 1 and read it through sort of in chronological order.
They're the best sort of books, definitely, because it's engaging, but also it makes you think about your practice and how you can localize it to where you are and what you need for your children. I think the one thing that I did want to ask you was, one of the things that I know within my trust where I am now, we are very trauma informed in the sense of we have children and families where you can't imagine the lives that they've had before they've entered the school gates. We can't. And so with that comes, in terms of developmental, well, I don't want to say anything other than like developmentally, because of that trauma, that has had an impact on their brain development, that has had an impact on how they socialize, on their behavioral, not necessarily choices, but how they behave, because it's a form of communication. So where we have, and it's become more apparent, I think, since the pandemic as well, because the inequity that was there within society actually was highlighted even further with the pandemic. How would you enable this book to be used in a way where, because there are, and like you said, like hope, and it is possible, I completely believe you, and I'm part of that in terms of like, I've been part of that where, you change those children's lives for the better, and you do it as a cultural seismic shift in some schools. But where it does come down to like being trauma informed, how do you, like, which chapter would you say you'd recommend, to use that as part of CPD, or to enable staff to understand that it's not necessarily a child's fault where they've come from or what's happened, because they're innocent souls who, like, that decision to be brought into the world wasn't made by them, it was made by other people. So, how do you use the book to enable that understanding, that, and it's a deep human understanding?
Totally. So I think the section that really speaks to class teachers around effective teaching and learning really emphasizes the need to understand where a child is at the current moment in their understanding, where their gaps might be, and what they most need to learn next, and how you're going to plan to help them on sort of the next stage of their learning journey. And I would absolutely say that we know not all children are going to learn at the same pace at the same time, which is why our current assessment system, where we have sort of, end of term, end of year, high stakes
Yeah.
assessments where everybody has to sit the same exam on the same day, regardless of whether they're ready, is so difficult. And, that's a real challenge for us in the education sector at the moment. It's not like a music exam or a driving exam where you take it when you're ready.
Yeah.
But the section about building relationships, I think, is where you absolutely have to start. So I write a lot about ways in which I've seen schools really build strong relationships with children, with their families, not just their parents or carers, but with entire families and communities through things like home visits, through building great opportunities for community learning on site, through uh, supporting members of staff to really understand the local community, walk the local areas, see what it's like in the local park, understand what might be the tensions or the challenges of growing up in that area. We have lots of schools, don't we, where staff sort of come in from miles away, teach the school day, disappear at the end of the day, and perhaps aren't really connected in with the community. And I think we know that we can't do this amazing work alone. However great we are as educators, we rely on families to work with us as co-educators. And the more we can build really strong, mutually respectful parental engagement, the more chance I think we have to sort of to utilize all those hours in the day, not just the hours that children are in school with us, to support them, to help to build them to be more independent and resilient and self-regulating learners. There's a whole chapter around metacognition. And as I was writing this during the pandemic, it was really weird. This book took me almost exactly 9 months to write, which, given the obstetrics analogy, was just a little bit sort of spooky. But it was due, I only got the time to write this because obviously in the pandemic, leading a school improvement organisation where, colleagues go into schools is really challenging because you can't physically go into schools and support during a pandemic. So we were having to completely sort of reinvent the way that we worked and do it a little bit more from distance. And it gave me a little bit of time to pull together my learning as a leader and from seeing other leaders. But it was so interesting thinking about the way that at Isaac Newton Academy, the school that I built up from scratch, we'd really prioritised teaching children right from the age of 4 to be self-starters as learners and independent learners, and how it's schools where that had been a priority that perhaps found adapting to the pandemic slightly less of a challenge because children were better equipped to organise their learning, to think about when they were going to learn, how they were going to learn, who their learning partners were going to be. So I think I've gone roundabout kind of in answering your question. I think that the sections about building relationships, supporting children to organise their own learning and hopefully be in charge of their own learning and have that sort of self-efficacy that they can control their destinies through, be it through making themselves stronger learners, but also really tapping into the community and realizing that we can't work in isolation. Educating a child is about working with the whole extended family and community.
Takes a village, to raise a child. It's that saying, isn't it? Rachel, it's been absolutely inspiring listening to you, and I wish I could have visited one of your schools when you were head or just within the education system, because you are inspiring. And I think everyone listening will absolutely see this being an essential part of their CPD library in schools. It's definitely, I know I've mapped out some of the CPD calendar for spring term actually, because I think what is amazing about the book is that there's that breadth as well as depth. And I love the fact that you've got case study examples, you've got real life examples of where it's working in schools. And more importantly than that, it's not that it's like a flash in the pan thing, it's a cultural thing, and it's something that, like you said earlier, it's sustained. And I think that's the legacy of a good leader, number one, but also that's what we'd want for every child coming into any school, that they're having the same equitable, fair chance that every other child did when they got there before them. So yeah, Rachel, it's been absolutely wonderful listening to you. Thank you so much for today.
It's an
Is there
absolute pleasure.
No, thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to say about the book before we end?
I don't think so. Just to pick up on what you said earlier, that we live in a really inequitable society, and some of those inequities have become even starker and even more evident in the last few years. For a whole variety of reasons. So I think more than ever we need to be thinking about doing more, doing different, doing better for our most underserved learners. We have this wonderful opportunity as educators, and sometimes it's for 5 years, 7 years, if you're in an all through school, as I was in the end of my career in schools, 14 years. That's a magical opportunity to create a really special, safe, equitable environment, and to make a difference, so that hopefully the inequities that we see coming through the school gates when children arrive with us are not then writ large, a few years later when they pass out from us onto the next stage of their hopefully really exciting and rewarding and fulfilling lives.
Rachel, thank you. I think that's the perfect way to end, really. Thank you so much for today. And yeah, I think there'll be lots of people using the discount code from Crown Publishing to buy your book, so 30% off. So that will be part of what we share when we're bringing the video out as well. But thank you so much for your time today, Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks very much.